Okay, we have about 25 minutes for questions and answers. Shimon.
Probably not the last one, to make the proposition that if the international community somehow were to halt Iran from going down the military nuclear, the NPT regime will be salvaged. But earlier you have listed the deficiencies which have been part of the NPT regime long before Iran came on our screen. So tell me, why is it that you see that the future of the NPT regime and its deficiencies will be somehow taken care of if miraculously the problem of Iran will be taken care of?
I think that the problem is not when Iran came off. The problem is today, and I think that I really only mentioned from today onwards what I see. I think that if Iran, I'll put it the other way, which I think I wrote it in that way. If Iran is prevented from doing the things I mentioned, from even enriching a large amount to even below military grade, I think that the non-proliferation regime, I really prefer that term to the NPT, will have a better chance because the world will have proved its will. It's not a direct thing with Iran. It will happen not because Iran, out of the goodness of its heart, will suddenly decide not to go that way. It will happen because the world took the action which is missing right now. I think that there is a lot of action to be taken. I think there is, and I don't mean only a military option. I think there are many options to be taken with Iran to persuade Iran. And if that is done, there is a good chance that the proliferators or potential proliferators will say, okay, we are in danger. If we go that way, we'll end that way. On the other hand, if Iran goes its merry way, I'm not sure that the regime, the non-proliferation regime, it can survive.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Bruno, which is a continuation of a question I once asked him 10 years ago on a California arms control beach conference with ASCO and DETRA and SAIC. The NPT is very much related to a certain strategic culture or view of a world. And then, as in now, there are alternatives. For example, the French view espoused by Raymond Aron in the New Republic, that the uneasy peace that exists as a consequence of dissuasion, not deterrence. The French view of dissuasion. And prior to the NPT, there were alternatives viewed, one of which was, if everyone has it, it negates itself. The regime of the NPT is to prevent, but the alternative is, if there's equality with everyone having it, it's an alternative. I do understand there's obviously concerns of safety, accidents, and so forth. But it's like withholding a sweet from a child. The child will always want the sweet. If you give or offer the child the sweet, you have the alternative. So my question relates to the strategic culture view of certain countries which don't espouse the Western bipolar view which created the NPT. What strategic cultures are out there which can offer different views for preventing proliferation or negating the value of a nuclear weapon system? I.e., are there any forms of alternative regimes from a different cultural viewpoint.
Really? You said that you raised that question to me 10 years ago. Can you remind me what I replied?
Pass another beer.
I don't subscribe to the view that Raymond Aron had an alternative narrative. I mean, it was a slightly different narrative, but the translation for dissuasion is deterrence. It's not dissuasion. Look, it's a very hypothetical question because nobody thinks we're going to give up the NPT anytime soon. But even in the very hypothetical case where we could imagine alternatives, I don't think any of the NPT stakeholder is ready to take a chance on that. You are absolutely right to remind us of the origins of the treaty, and it was talked about yesterday too. I think the NPT community has more or less managed to transform an instrument of bipolarity, of bipolar order, into something which is a collective, a common good, a form of common good, because it's as universal as it can be. But how much can it remain a common good if 3 or 4 countries which could have had a special status in the NPT don't have a status? I think you're just pointing your finger at the fundamental imperfections and imbalances of the NPT. Are there alternatives? Would we build it, write it exactly the same way today? Probably no. I would just say that whatever hypothetical alternatives there may be, the collective view of the NPT stakeholders is that it's probably not worth taking the chance of exploring them.
Any questions from? So I'll take the floor and take the prerogative of.
I would have a question for Cameron, actually.
Sure, go ahead.
If you don't mind. Your analogy is very fruitful, as any good analogy could be. Could you describe for us how, in your mental framework, in the cognitive framework that you describe, how would you qualify the hypothesis of a Brazil making step towards a nuclear weapons capability, take into account the differences and resemblances between the U.S.-Brazil relation and the U.S.-Saudi Arabia relation? Would a country like Brazil, or I can't think of any other one at the moment, but if you compare the record of pressures and sanctions against India, for instance, can you draw any lessons from a hypothetical Brazilian nuclear military program, taking into account the fact that Brazil is a member of the NPT, and assuming that, and then taking into account 2 different scenarios, one where Brazil goes in that direction after the NPT after the bank run, and taking into account the scenario where Brazil makes such steps while being still in the NPT. I'm not obsessed by Brazil. It's just that yesterday Brazil was mentioned 3 times, so I thought let's continue to talk about it. It's interesting.
Brazil, it is an interesting case in particular because, again, I think the most important thing is actually to start at the end of that. In other words, to think about this question of who proliferates and who doesn't. And as of today, when we look at the 9 countries who pushed all the way through and bore all the costs involved with going nuclear, of them, they all had a direct national security threat. There were other countries that have developed programs that did not have, that wasn't the key concern necessarily, but they didn't necessarily go all the way through either. In Brazil's case, my question then is, so what's the security concern, right? And again, I understand that there's a prestige question on their end, but as I suggested before, so long as enforcement costs are high, in other words, so long as it's clear to any potential proliferator that you don't do this cheaply, then what exactly is the regional influence that they're going to gain by being cut off from regional trade? I don't see the other countries in the region thrilled about the idea, right? I mean, Argentina clearly isn't going to be thrilled by the idea, and I'm sure that precisely as you've seen in the Middle East, it's far from clear for me that these countries would say, oh, well, Brazil is going nuclear. We should do more with them, and it tends to be quite the opposite, right? That then, just like Saudi Arabia is willing to, in all sorts of ways, signal that it would be just fine with a strike on Iran, it would be interesting to see exactly how straight Argentina, in particular, would be about a Brazilian nuclear option. So I think that would be the most important thing. And the question is, to what degree are they immune to international enforcement? And to the best of my understanding, actually, they'd be quite, they aren't too big to fail. It would be costly to the rest of the world, right? Anyone who's such a big component of world GDP and international trade is going to hurt. But the question is, one, are there alternatives, right? Even China, as central as China is today, China has alternatives. Vietnam, right, could produce a lot of what China produces. There's nothing inherent about China and its 1.3 billion people that makes it particularly unique. Saudi Arabia is a problem because it has unique characteristics that no other country has, right? Its swing capacity to produce oil is unlike any others, and now again, should the energy market be transformed, and that's not inconceivable, but should it be transformed, then maybe Saudi Arabia would be in a much worse position. But in this sense, I don't see Brazil as being immune.
May I ask you, Bruno, about the cognitive dissonance that apparently might be somewhere in your argument, and I share your basic approach. What kind of mechanisms or strategies one can imagine in order to limit this dissonance in terms of the distinction between the deterrence effect of nuclear weapons, which is still there, and the way to persuade new proliferators or potential proliferators not to go in this direction. So one can imagine, for instance, thinking in terms of developing more, and the United States is doing it to an extent, more reliance on conventional capabilities. But then, of course, you have the problem that states that are weak with conventional arms would say, aha, the United States has its capabilities, but we need nuclear weapons in order to deter it, and so on and so forth. So do you have in mind any ways to tackle this apparent contradiction between the two approaches? One might, of course, argue that nuclear weapons were less important in overall in deterrence and so on. This is one way to deal with it.
Look, I think there are several ways to tackle what you call cognitive dissonance, which I continue to believe is not cognitive dissonance. There is a way to talk about nuclear weapons which does not make them all-purpose weapons which are absolutely necessary for one's security. They just take them as a fact of life. Nuclear sharing has proven to be a very interesting way to reduce the gap between the nuclears. The nuclear have and the nuclear have not, but it's of course limited to a small subset of non-nuclear countries, those who are allies of nuclear power. And look, let me refine in one sentence what I think about nuclear weapons. I think they are an insurance against the failure of the liberal peace project. I think that the overall trend in the past 200 years has been more towards the Kantian project than towards the Hobbesian project. We could discuss that at another seminar. But I'm a firm believer in the strengths of the democratic idea. I think that the overall evolution of world politics on the long run goes in that direction. So it's an insurance. The problem is that some countries, Russia in particular, considers them as an instrument to restore their past glory, which I think is a very different way from considering them as a necessary evil, so to say. At this point, I will stop here.
Thank you very much.
No microphone. Okay, I have still voice. So I start. Yeah, no, it's okay. I start with a light remark and then a serious question. Way back when we had our ups and downs with the Iranians, one evening, one of them said, "Olli, do you know where chess was invented?" I said, "Yeah, it was in Persia." He said, "You got it right, but you have one problem. We played poker." But to Cameron, your analogy or this bluffing, it's a good thing to test. But like statements from Kuwait, they were done at the time of so-called nuclear renaissance, when everyone was thinking of building nuclear power plants in the middle of that region. So I think that it's not valid anymore today. It was not for Iran, their nuclear. Then Saudi Arabia, I think it was a good analogy, but you should go further because there are many other parameters to measure intentions. And one set of them are the public statements of Saudi princes, read the WikiLeaks and all these ones. There are some things which might be a little bit disturbing. And then you can also look how their nuclear landscape is now changing. They are reorganizing. There's a new institution there. This 16-reactor plan, just for the sake of curiosity, it means that you can maintain your own enrichment with the
So, first of all, it's a nice story about Persians playing poker. This question, I'd like to just pick up first on something you'd said about the public statements of princes, Saudi princes, and restate something I'd said before. My anticipation is that all countries in the region are going to make continual statements suggesting or hinting, first of all, saying explicitly that they're interested in civilian nuclear programs, right? And then in the Saudi case, they're even willing to go so far, and again, I think because they're too big to fail, they're willing to take those big risks of saying even to American diplomats that they'd consider, or they'd actually go nuclear if the Iranians go nuclear, right? But as I've said, in my mind, this game is one where you all have an incentive to say that you do this. The real question is, are they going to actually go through with it? And again, what I want to see is not just the announcement of building CARE and other Saudi projects in the 16-reactor plan. I want to see them built, right? I want to see them actually getting operational. And then, because it's really easy to declare that I've got a plan and there's 28 reactors here and here's the sites I'm going to build them. Any country can do that, right? The one who's serious about this is the one who's going to show you in some way, shape, or form that they're serious. Now, again, the problem, as I suggested in the talk, the problem I have with the Saudis is that even to say that they're going to build it, it's what's really going to concern me and make me think that this isn't bluster is when they send people to go get training, when they have indigenous people who have the training, right? Libya's program, one of the really neat things about the IAEA report on Libya in 2004 was that they didn't have the indigenous capacity to read the plans that they were being supplied by the Khan network, right? They couldn't. They had no one in the country to do that. When the Saudis have enough people that they can do all this work indigenously, right? And that's now Iran's problem. Is they are now, we used to call this the point of no return in Israel. They have plenty of indigenous capacity. They have plenty of technological know-how. When the Saudis start building that, they don't have to get there, but when they start really investing it, now I'm concerned.
There was another. Oh,
Disappointed in 5 years' time.
Michael.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on the bank run analogy, which I think is very suggestive, but just to reflect a little bit on the North Korean experience.
Is the mic?
So is it
Yeah.
still not on?
Yeah.
Okay, you can. Okay. So we had the agreed framework with the North Koreans in 1994. Right? It's almost 20 years ago. And now, and they've detonated 3 times, and no one doubts that they have at least a few nuclear weapons. Now, what's happened in those 20 years? They're more isolated than ever. They have no leverage over anyone. The U.S. has, in fact, reduced its combat forces in South Korea after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The U.S. has canceled a nuclear-tipped cruise missile program to help the Japanese. I hadn't actually explored this myself. I'm just trying to think, is it possible that without explicit security guarantees by the United States to 10 other countries in the region, that if Iran actually acquired a weapon, not much would happen? Or is that so heretical, so naive to not even generate a response? It is, I think, a little odd that, I think the consensus view is that it will trigger proliferation.
Right.
Turkey, Saudi Arabia, who knows who else. And we do have this other part of the world where it's been amazingly quiet. Now you say, well, it's been amazingly quiet because the U.S. has, unmistakable, explicit security guarantees with Japan and South Korea that date back 50 years.
This is really interesting. In particular, I'd like to think about Japan for a second, right? Anyone who's looked at the Japanese discussion on nuclear proliferation, their internal, right? Because domestically, it's terribly unpopular for a government to speak specifically and outright about even considering building a bomb. The Japanese case is actually the exact opposite of what I would have been suggesting about the Middle East. Here, public statements and leaked documents are costly signals, right? And there's been Japanese governments that have found themselves in hot water precisely because it got out that they had internal discussions about proliferation, right? Precisely the opposite of what I'm telling you happens in the Middle East. In Japan, what was interesting is post the '94 agreement, right? It happened afterwards, that the Japanese started saying to themselves, maybe we have to prepare for this. Right? And just the idea that there were discussions about this created a substantial domestic political cost, which is why I take those, right, and that cost is why I take those deliberations and the leak of them seriously, right? If such a thing happened in the Middle East, then I would look at Saudi prince statements and I would say, oh, we should take that seriously, right? In Germany, those sorts of things should be taken seriously. In Japan, right? But I think you're right. And of course, one of the key differences is, and this goes back to one of the points I made, there are specific obligations to certain countries in East Asia that don't exist in the Gulf. And I think the U.S. is going to have to consider whether or not they should be making explicit security guarantees, formal security guarantees to the Gulf. Now, there are some people who would say, well, if you do that, in a certain sense, you're saying we're actually talking about containment, right? You might be hinting that we're willing to accept this. Could look at that way. Could also say to yourself, the Iranians are going to have to ask themselves again, what do we get out of having a nuclear weapon? Are we, as you've pointed out, and I'm glad that you second what I've suggested about regional influence, actually reduced after you get nuclear weapons, not increased. Could the Iranians say, well, it turns out that if we actually go nuclear, we're going to be in a worse situation than if we don't, and that maybe our optimal situation is right where we are right now. Forget because of the pressure of sanctions on us. It may just also be because we're going to throw other countries into the Americans' arms even more, right? Just like the Soviets had this problem with Turkey, right? In 1950, it was even Khrushchev admitted that Stalin threw the Turks into the Americans' arms. And the same thing could come one day to the Iranians' cognizance.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this. Michael, I think you're absolutely right that we should all guard against these quasi-deterministic provisions of cascading. But I think that when you make the comparison between Northeast Asia and the Middle East, and I know you've studied and practiced these things, but my view on this is the following. First, that the arch enemy of Saudi Arabia has designs and an ability to fulfill these designs on the region that North Korea does not have anymore, because North Korea has ceased to be something else than just a very difficult and problematic neighbor for South Korea. Granted, North Korea bombs ships and bombs small islands, but it does not have grand designs on the whole region, which is something that in Saudi eyes Iran has. Second, from my point of view, and tell me if I'm wrong, I would say that Saudi Arabia does not and cannot benefit from an overt public American nuclear guarantee. Does not and cannot benefit from an overt American nuclear guarantee. First of all, because it does not want it, and I suspect also because the American public, again, tell me if I'm wrong, would raise eyebrows at the idea of extending a nuclear guarantee to a country which has produced the vast majority of the 9/11 bombers, for starters, and the list could go on. Anyway, I mean, it's not a simple debate, neither in the US nor in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia would not want it because, by definition, the US would have failed to solve the Iranian issue. And finally, I would add that Saudi Arabia sees itself as different from the others in the Gulf. And look at the way it entered the civilian nuclear game. In a typical Saudi way, they wanted to show they are different. They entered the game later than the others. They entered the game big time with big plans. They entered the game big time with big plans which were not affected by Fukushima. Major differences with the civilian nuclear plants of most of the other Arab nations. So that's another way for me to say that the Saudi case is really special.
And troublesome.
And troublesome, yeah.
Well, I think we have approached exactly the time of wrapping up. Thank you very much, all the participants.